Walter Mercer had walked the same 18 holes every Sunday morning for almost 30 years. He knew which trees threw their shadows first in the evening, which greens stayed soft after rain, and exactly how the light crossed the fairway as the sun climbed over the tree line behind the clubhouse. What he never knew, and what almost no one who ever set foot on that grass for the past 100 years ever knew, was that he was walking across one of the most advanced scientific instruments built by human hands anywhere on Earth. Not built with steel, not built with stone tools, built with nothing but packed earth, patience, and a knowledge of the night sky so exact that it would take modern surveyors with satellites and laser equipment decades to confirm it was even real. The ground beneath that golf course in Newark, Ohio, had been shaped roughly 2,000 years ago by a people historians now call the Hopewell. They left behind no books, no metal tools, and no city walls. What they left was geometry. An enormous earthen octagon, connected by parallel walls to a near-perfect circle, stretching across hundreds of acres with a level of precision that still unsettles engineers today. Researchers who eventually studied the site discovered that its walls were not random at all. They were built to track the rising and setting of the moon across an 18-and-a-half-year cycle, a celestial pattern so slow and so subtle that recognizing it would have required generations of careful observation passed down by people who never wrote a single word of it down. Some who have studied both sites argue it is more precise than Stonehenge. To do this, the Hopewell did not have access to telescopes or written calendars. They had only patience and an unbroken chain of observers who watched the same patch of horizon, season after season, year after year, recording shifts in the moonrise so small that an untrained eye would never notice them at all. Imagine standing in an open field at night, watching nothing but darkness, waiting for a sliver of light to break the tree line, knowing that the exact spot it appears will matter not just this year, but 18 years from now. That is the kind of attention it took to build what still stands in that Ohio field today, hidden for so long beneath nothing more than fairways and parking lots. For most of American history, almost none of this was known outside a small circle of historians and archaeologists. By the early 20th century, the land had been leased to a private club, and the ancient walls were leveled, mowed, and built around until they simply became part of the landscape, an oddity golfers stepped over without a second thought. For more than 100 years, access to one of the most significant ancient monuments in North America was controlled not by the public, not by the descendants of the people who built it, but by a small group of members paying yearly dues to play 18 holes on top of it. Most of them, by every account, never thought twice about what was really under their feet. But not everyone forgot. For decades, historians, archaeologists, and native nations whose ancestors built these earthworks pushed to get the land back into public hands. What started as a quiet disagreement turned into one of the strangest legal fights in modern American history, a battle that would eventually reach the highest court in the state of Ohio. It would take lawsuits, a court ruling comparing the site to the pyramids and to Stonehenge, and a buyout fight over a lease that did not legally expire until the year 2078. It is a story about how close America came to losing something irreplaceable simply because nobody was paying close enough attention, and about the small number of people who refused to let that happen. By the time this story is over, you will understand exactly how a 2,000-year-old observatory ended up under a sand trap, how it took a courtroom battle and a small army of researchers, lawyers, and tribal leaders to bring it back into the light, and what finally happened the night the gates opened again after more than 100 years. Walter Mercer, and thousands of golfers just like him, had no idea what they had been standing on the entire time. You are about to find out exactly what it was, and exactly how close it came to staying buried forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Walter Mercer never asked himself how a golf course got built around the shape of a perfect octagon. Nobody did. For 100 years, that question simply never came up, not over coffee in the clubhouse, not during a Sunday round, not even when new members were shown the unusual layout of the back nine. The walls were just there, the way hills are just there, something the landscape had always done. But once you learn what those walls actually are, the question becomes impossible to ignore. Who builds something like this? with no metal tools, no draft animals, and no written language, and somehow makes it accurate enough that modern scientists with satellites and laser equipment needed years just to confirm it was real. That question alone is enough to keep historians awake at night, and it is only the first of three that this story is going to force you to sit with. The second question is harder to answer, and far more uncomfortable. If this site was truly one of the most significant ancient monuments in North America, how did a private club end up controlling access to it for more than a century? Not a government agency, not a museum, not the descendants of the people who built it. A membership-only club, charging yearly dues, deciding who could and could not walk across ground that predates the founding of the country it sits in by close to 2,000 years. For generations, almost nobody outside a small circle of researchers seemed to question whether that arrangement made any sense at all, and almost nobody asked what it would actually take to undo it. And then there is the third question, the one that sounds almost impossible until you confirm it happened. How does a site like this end up named alongside the Great Wall of China, the Pyramids of Giza, and the Taj Mahal, recognized by an international body as one of the most culturally significant places on the planet, while a group of men in polo shirts are still booking tea times on top of it? That is not a hypothetical. That actually happened, and the timeline of how it happened is stranger than most people would believe. Who built this place? Why was it kept from the public for so long? And how did the world come to recognize its importance before the public could even walk through the gates? Keep watching, because the answers are far stranger than anything you might be imagining right now. Long before Walter Mercer ever set foot on that golf course, before there were scorecards or clubhouses or paved roads anywhere near it, a people historians now call the Hopewell were already standing on that same patch of Ohio ground, watching the sky. They lived roughly 2,000 years ago, somewhere between 100 BCE and 400 CE, and they left behind no books, no metal tools, and no written language of any kind. What they left behind instead was earth. Massive, deliberate, carefully measured earth, shaped into walls and circles, and an octagon so precise that anyone walking past it today would assume it had been laid out with modern surveying equipment. It had not. It had been built by hand, basket load by basket load, by people working with nothing but packed soil and an understanding of the world that modern science is still struggling to fully explain. What makes this site remarkable is not just its size, though the size alone is staggering, stretching across roughly 4 square miles of land. What makes it remarkable is what it was actually built to do. Researchers eventually discovered that the walls were aligned to track the rising and setting of the moon across an 18-and-a-half-year cycle, a pattern so slow that the moon's exact rise point on the horizon shifts only a small amount each year before reversing course nearly 2 decades later. To notice that pattern at all, someone would have needed to watch the same stretch of sky, year after year, for an entire lifetime, and then pass that knowledge down to the next generation, who would have had to do the same thing, simply to confirm that the pattern held true. That is the part of this story that tends to stop people in their tracks. This was not a lucky guess. It was not a rough approximation. Some researchers who have compared the two sites argue that this alignment is more precise than the famous stone circle at Stonehenge in England, a structure built by a different civilization on a different continent, using completely different methods, and studied by scientists for centuries longer. And yet here, in the middle of Ohio, on ground that would one day have a flag marking the 7th hole, an entirely different people had achieved something just as exact, using nothing but soil, patience, and an unbroken chain of careful observation. For a long time, this site was not unique in the landscape around it. Thousands of similar earthworks once stretched across Ohio, mounds and walls and geometric enclosures built by the same tradition of careful observation and ceremony. Most of them are gone now, leveled by 19th-century farming, cut through by canal construction, or paved over entirely as towns and cities expanded outward without a second thought for what was underneath them. What survived here, in this one place, survived almost by accident, overlooked just long enough to avoid the same fate. But surviving the plow and surviving the next 100 years of American history would turn out to be two very different things. By the early 20th century, the deeper meaning of this place had faded from public memory almost entirely. Local families knew the land had unusual mounds and walls running through it. But the full scale of what those walls represented, the astronomy, the precision, the generations of observation it had taken to build them, had simply slipped out of common knowledge. The people who once carried that understanding forward had no one left to pass it on to. And so, by 1910, almost nobody remembered what this place actually was. And that's when the gates went up, not to protect it, to play golf on it. Before any of this land became a golf course, it served a different purpose entirely. Between 1892 and 1908, the state of Ohio used the site as a training ground for its militia, soldiers marching and drilling across earthen walls that had already stood there for close to 2,000 years, with little apparent attention paid to what those walls actually represented. It was, in a strange way, one more chapter in a long pattern of the land being used without being understood. The walls were treated as terrain, not as monuments. Convenient high ground, not a calendar built to track the moon. That pattern continued in 1910, when the property was leased to a private country club. Over the following years, the club built greens, fairways, and sand traps directly over and around the ancient embankments, shaping its entire course around walls that had been engineered with extraordinary precision centuries before the first golf ball was ever struck there. Photographs from that era show members in collared shirts and caps standing on manicured grass, with the unmistakable shape of the ancient earthworks rising gently behind them, treated as little more than scenic hills framing the back nine. For most who played there, the walls were simply part of the course's charm, an unusual landscape feature, nothing more. It would be unfair to pretend the club's role in this story was simple. For more than 100 years, that lease allowed the club to maintain the land, keep it from being subdivided or developed, and provide consistent upkeep that arguably helped the earthworks survive at all. Members paid dues, followed the rules of a private club, and largely saw themselves as caretakers of an unusual but beloved golf course. At the same time, that same arrangement meant the public, and more pointedly, the descendants of the very people who built this site, had no consistent right to walk freely across ground their ancestors had shaped with such care. Visits required permission. Access was limited, controlled, and inconsistent, year after year, decade after decade. As the 20th century wore on, historians and archaeologists who understood the astronomical significance of the site began raising concerns more frequently, and native nations with ancestral ties to the region grew increasingly vocal about a ceremonial, sacred space being treated as private recreational property. Walter Mercer and the thousands of golfers who walked that course across those decades were, for the most part, simply enjoying a Sunday round, unaware they were standing at the center of a quiet but growing disagreement about who that ground truly belonged to, and what it actually meant to leave it locked behind a clubhouse and a membership fee. For most of the 20th century, almost nobody questioned this. Then, in the 1980s, a team of researchers asked a question that would change everything. In 1982, a small team of researchers from Earlham College arrived at the site with a very specific question in mind. Was the strange octagon shape, the one golfers like Walter Mercer had walked past for decades without a second thought, simply an unusual but accidental piece of geography, or had it been deliberately engineered to do something far more precise? To answer that, they could not rely on guesswork. They had to walk the walls themselves, measure every angle by hand, and compare what they found against the slow, predictable drift of the moon across the night sky, a cycle that takes 18.5 years to complete from start to finish. That kind of research does not happen in an afternoon. It requires patience stretched across years, returning to the same mounds again and again, recording the moon's position as it rose along the horizon, watching for the extreme points in its cycle, the moments when its rise shifts as far north or south as it ever will before slowly reversing course. Researchers stood where ancient observers once stood, before sunrise, instruments in hand, checking the same angles their predecessors 2,000 years earlier had checked using nothing but memory and inherited knowledge passed down through generations with no written language to record any of it. What they eventually confirmed was almost difficult to accept. Viewed from the central mound, the moon rises at its most extreme point within roughly half a degree of true alignment with the walls. That is not an approximation. That is a level of precision some researchers argue meets or exceeds Stonehenge, a structure built on a different continent, by a different civilization, studied by scientists for considerably longer. For this alignment to exist at all, generations of Hopewell skywatchers had to observe, record without writing, and accurately transmit astronomical knowledge across lifetimes, simply so the people building these walls would know exactly where to place them decades before construction ever began. Brad Lepper, an archaeologist with the Ohio History Connection who has spent years studying this site, has described standing in that exact spot as something close to connecting directly with the people who built it, watching the same moon they once watched, rising in the same place it always has. The science, by this point, was no longer in question. What remained unsettled was something far more complicated. The science was settled, but getting the public back onto this land would take another 40 years, and a fight that went all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court. The legal foundation beneath this fight had been set decades earlier and quietly renewed without much public attention. The original 1910 lease was extended in 1997, locking the arrangement in place until the year 2078, a date so distant that most people signing those papers likely never imagined anyone would seriously try to undo it before then. For years, that lease simply sat there, a quiet legal fact tucked away in county records, while Walter Mercer and generations of golfers like him kept booking tee times, unaware that the ground beneath their cleats carried any legal complications at all. That quiet arrangement began to unravel in 2018, when the Ohio History Connection, the state's historical organization, filed suit to reclaim the lease. Their argument rested on the site's extraordinary historical and cultural significance, not as a recreational amenity, but as one of the most important ancient monuments in North America. The case moved slowly through the courts, gathering attention from historians, archaeologists, and native nations who had waited decades for exactly this kind of legal challenge. The case eventually escalated all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court, where a judge weighed in with language that surprised even seasoned observers. The ruling effectively compared the site's significance to landmarks like Stonehenge and the pyramids, a striking acknowledgement from inside a courtroom that this was not simply a property dispute, but a question about how the country treats its oldest and most irreplaceable monuments. In 2022, the court ruled that the state could use eminent domain to buy out the club's lease entirely, clearing the legal path toward returning the land to public hands well ahead of that distant 2078 expiration date. Behind that ruling stood years of effort from indigenous leaders, historians, and local advocates who had pushed for this outcome long before most of the public ever knew the fight was happening at all. The court had ruled, but the world was about to recognize this site before the public could even set foot on it. On September 19, 2023, this site, alongside 7 other earthworks across Ohio, was officially named the state's first UNESCO World Heritage Site, placing it on a list shared with the pyramids of Giza, the Great Wall of China, and the Taj Mahal. And yet, at the exact moment that announcement was made, the legal buyout had not yet closed. The Octagon was still, in practice, a functioning private golf course. Somewhere on those same grounds, men not unlike Walter Mercer were likely still booking tee times that very week, walking the same fairways, completely unaware that the ground beneath them had just been formally recognized as one of the most significant cultural sites on the planet. The contrast was almost impossible to script. A global ceremony honoring an ancient observatory, happening in parallel with golfers quietly finishing their back nine. Chief Glenna Wallace of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma offered a reaction that captured the weight of the moment, describing the builders of this site not simply as skilled, but as uncommon geniuses, a tribute aimed squarely at correcting a century of underestimation. For indigenous nations with ancestral ties to this land, the designation was not just an honor. It was a long overdue correction. The world had finally recognized what this place was. Now came the hardest part, actually getting the keys. In August 2024, after years of legal maneuvering and mounting public attention, a deal was finally reached. The country club agreed to leave the land it had occupied since 1910, closing a chapter that had stretched across more than a century and 3 legal generations. The agreement did not happen overnight, and it did not happen quietly, but it happened, and for the first time since before most living members of that club were even born, The path was clear for the public to reclaim ground that had never truly belonged to any private organization in the first place. On January 1st, 2025, the gates opened. Roughly 800 people arrived that day, walking across grass that had been fairways just weeks earlier, many of them seeing the full shape of the ancient walls clearly for the first time in their lives. There were no scorecards, no clubhouse fees, no membership requirements. Just open ground. The same ground Walter Mercer had walked for nearly 30 years without ever truly understanding what it was. He came back that week, not with golf clubs, but simply to walk the land as a visitor, the way generations before the club, and long before that, the way the Hopewell themselves once had. Not long after, something happened that answered the very question this story opened with. A crowd gathered after dark, carrying red light flashlights instead of golf bags, waiting in silence for the moon to clear the tree line at the exact point the ancient builders had calculated nearly 2,000 years earlier. Visitors who experienced it described the moment as peaceful, almost somber, an entire crowd standing quietly together, watching the same moonrise that sky watchers had tracked across countless generations, finally witnessed again by the public it had always been built for. Even now, the story is not entirely finished. Historians estimate that more than 900 additional earthworks remain on private land across Ohio today, with potentially thousands more never identified at all, scattered beneath farmland, neighborhoods, and quite possibly other golf courses no one has thought to question yet. Walter Mercer's 18 holes turned out to be only one small piece of a much larger story still waiting underground, and after everything it took just to bring this single site back into the light, it raises an uncomfortable question about how much more of America's oldest history is still sitting, unnoticed, directly beneath our feet. Walter Mercer spent nearly 30 years walking that golf course without ever once questioning what was beneath his feet, and he is far from the only one. Across this country, there are backyards, farm fields, parking lots, and yes, almost certainly other golf courses, sitting quietly on top of history nobody has bothered to look closely at. So here is the question worth sitting with. If a 2,000-year-old American monument, precise enough to track the moon across an 18-and-a-half-year cycle, could remain hidden under fairways and sand traps for more than a century, what do you think might still be buried in your own backyard? Historians estimate that more than 900 additional earthworks remain on private land across Ohio alone, with potentially thousands more never identified at all. That is not the end of this story. That is closer to the beginning of the next one, and we fully intend to go looking. If you want more real stories the history books skipped, the ones hiding in plain sight under places you would never think to question, subscribe, because we dig into one every week.